think I'm recording. Hold on. Yeah. Okay. So again, good evening. My name is Elvira Rodriguez, and I am the Assistant Director of Customer Service and Outreach here for the University of Houston Downtown Financial Aid Office. And I wanted to present to you guys about the changes that are coming with the new FAFSA that was just released, the 24-25 application. It's being called Better FAFSA, Better Future, which is what I titled this presentation. And so we'll get started. I do want to say if you do have any questions at the end, I will leave some time to answer any questions that you might have. All right, so what we'll be talking about today, number one, we're going to be talking about why the FAFSA is changing. So some laws were passed that resulted in these new changes that are coming about. We'll then talk about exactly what those changes are going to be, including changes to the application format, to the process, as well as the eligibility. Next, we'll talk about contributors, and we'll go into a little bit more what that means, but I do want to particularly focus on parents. So parents can be considered contributors, and sometimes we know that it's not always a clean-cut decision on what parents' information is needed. So we'll kind of go through some different scenarios to kind of determine what parents' information might be needed on the application. We'll also talk about consent for federal tax information. So one of the major changes is now you have to go in and give consent for that FTI information to be added to your application. We'll talk more about what that looks like. We'll also talk about the Student Aid Index. We're going to call it SAI. That is going to be replacing what was the EFC, or expected family contribution. And what does that mean? We'll talk about what the differences are between those two items. And then I'll also cover Pell Grant. So Pell Grant is going to be changing, and so we'll cover what those changes look like. And then I'll conclude with just some new terms that are coming about as a result of all of these changes, just some terms that you need to be familiar with as you move forward. All right, so as I mentioned, all of these changes stemmed from some laws that were passed. So back on December 27th of 2020, two laws were passed. The first one is called the Future Act, and this one expands access to federal student aid, and it mandates that federal student aid is to use data that directly comes from the IRS. So that was the first one that passed. The second one is called the FAFSA Simplification Act, and this one introduced the actual changes to the actual application process. So changes to the FAFSA form itself, changes to how students and families actually complete the application, and then changes to the eligibility calculation. Now, all of these changes are going into effect with the new application that just came out, the 2024-2025 application. So with these changes, they're hoping that it will be a more streamlined application process for the user, as well as allow for more people to qualify for federal student aid. So number one, there is going to be a reduction in the amount of questions that are asked on the application. So currently the application is being reduced from 108 questions all the way to just 46. The application, because it is an online form and it is going to be dynamic, meaning that some of the questions you may not have to answer depending on how you respond to some questions. There may be some questions that you'll be able to skip. But essentially there will be about 46 questions on the application. The second change that you can expect is about the consent. So I kind of mentioned that in a few minutes ago when I was talking about what we were going to cover. So contributors, which are going to be the individuals who are going to be required to provide their information on the application, are going to be required to provide consent to allow their federal tax information to be imported into the application. So a contributor is going to be the student, you as the student. If you are a dependent student and your parents' information is needed, they will be considered a contributor. If you're an independent student and you're married, it's possible that your spouse may need to be considered a contributor and have to go in and give consent. But we'll go into that in a little bit as we talk more about that further on. I do want to note that if there's anybody that's a foreign tax filer, those filers will continue to self-report their tax information on the FAFSA form. Another change, and this is a big one, is the change to the formula that's being used to determine the student's eligibility. It is now going to be called the Student Aid Index, SAI. It is replacing what we currently know as the EFC, or Expected Family Contribution. So now you'll be hearing SAI instead of EFC, and I'll go over in a little bit what the differences are going to be between the EFC and what will now be the Student Aid Index, or SAI. And then one other change that I wanted to mention is in regards to the household size. So previously, when you completed the FAFSA application, one of the questions that you would be asked is how many people are in the household, as well as how many are in college. Well, now they will no longer ask that question, because they will take the information as far as the household size from your tax information or from your parents' tax information. Based on the exemptions that were claimed on the taxes, that'll be listed as what the family size number is. However, we do understand that household can change, right? Because we're looking at taxes from the year 2022 for this new FAFSA that came out. And so we're already in 2024. We know that the situation could have changed since 2022. So you will be allowed to self-report family size if it is different from what was reported on your taxes. So who is contributor? So again, a contributor is going to be any individual who's required to provide consent or approval to have their federal tax information, or FTI, along with their signature, to be included on the FAFSA form. So like I said, this is going to include you as a student, if you're married, your spouse, if you're a dependent student, your biological or adoptive parent, or in the case that your parent remarried, your step parent. So as I mentioned, I know sometimes the parent situation can be a little tricky, and it's not always a clear-cut decision on who you need to list. So we kind of have like a little chart here to kind of give you some help. But I will also say that the Department of Ed did create something called a parent wizard, which is a tool that will help you determine which parent's information is needed. So they'll ask you some questions, and based on those responses to those questions, it will say who of your parents you'll need to list their information, or have as a contributor rather. So in the instance where you have parents who live together, you are going to need both of their income and their assets. In the situation that your parents are divorced or separated, then you're going to include the parent who provided the greater support. So this is something different. Previously, you would use the parent who you lived with the most out of the year. Now it's going to be the parent who provided the greatest support to you. Now, if both parents did provide equal support, then the student is to use the parent who had the higher income. In the situation that there has been a death of a parent, then either the surviving parent will be considered a single parent, and that parent will have to provide their information. Unless they do remarry, then we'll need that step parent's information as well. If both parents are deceased, then the student won't report either parental income or assets. In the instance of a remarried parent, the new spouse of the parent, they will need to be included on the FAFSA, and they potentially will need to give their consent if they're being considered as a contributor. Lastly, single parent, their income and assets are going to be needed. So going back to who's going to need to be considered a contributor and give consent, it does depend on how taxes were filed. So I will use the example of a dependent student situation, whose parents filed. If they filed jointly, they filed one joint tax return, then only one parent needs to be a contributor and go in and give consent. Now, if both parents filed separately, they filed their separate tax returns, then both parents are contributors and both will have to go in and give consent to have access to their tax information. Same thing in the instance of a student who is married. If you file jointly with your spouse on your taxes, then only you are considered the contributor and only you need to go in and give consent to have access to your tax information. However, if you filed separately, then your spouse is going to be considered a contributor and will need to go in and give consent to have access to their tax information. So everyone who had, oh, sorry, went too fast. Everyone who is considered a contributor will need to have an FSA ID. So if you already have one, if your parents already have one, you do not need to sign up for a new one. This is only for those that have not previously signed up for an FSA ID. So if you've never signed up for one, you'll need to get one. If you're a dependent student and your parents do not have one and they've been identified as a contributor, or let's say your spouse, then they will need to sign up for an FSA ID. Something new with this is previously, if a parent or a spouse, let's say, didn't have a social security number, they could not sign up for an FSA ID. But now they are allowing everybody, regardless of you having a social security number or not, to be able to create an FSA ID. So you'll go through the process, or your parents will go through the process to sign up for the FSA ID. And if they do not have a social, they'll just check off the box that says, I do not have a social, and we'll be able to proceed through the process to sign up for an ID. Now, those without socials, they should be able to get access to that FSA right away, as long as they answer their questions correctly. So at the end of the process, once they're signing up, they will be asked some questions to identify or verify their identity. And as long as their identity is able to be verified, then they'll have their FSA ID ready to go and be able to complete the FAFSA application. In the instance of those that are signing up that do have a social security number, they will not be able to use their FSA ID right away because they do have to get verified. And so what we've been told is it can take up to 2 to 3 days to get that identity verified. Once it's been verified, then your parent, or in the case of a spouse, will be able to use their FSA ID. So if your contributor does not have one, have them sign up for that FSA ID as soon as possible, because there will be a couple of days delay before they can actually go in and complete their part of the application, because they have to wait to get their identity verified. All right, I keep jumping ahead too quick. All right, so those that are having to give consent, that have been identified as a contributor, there are some steps that will take place. Before we get into those steps, I do want to make note that being a contributor does not implicate financial responsibility, meaning we're not saying that they are responsible for your education, like they have to put money for it. But if they have been identified as a contributor, it does mean we need their information on your FAFSA application to determine your eligibility. And if a contributor refuses to provide their information, it will result in your application being incomplete, and we therefore won't be able to determine your eligibility, and so you won't be eligible for federal student aid. So it is important that anybody who's been identified as a contributor does go in and give that consent to have their federal tax information transferred into your application. So the consent to access the federal tax information, there'll be some steps. So step one, the contributor will receive an email informing them that they've been identified as a contributor. And then they'll be advised to log on to studentaid.gov to create an FSA ID if they don't already have one. Once that FSA ID has been created and it's been verified, then the contributor can log into the account using their FSA ID, and they will review these, then move on to step 4 and review the information and complete their section of the FAFSA form. Step 5, the contributor will then provide the required information on the FAFSA form and therefore complete their portion of the application. With the consent to give access to federal tax information, this information is being highly protected because this is coming directly from the IRS system. And so we want to let students and their families know that this federal tax information data is only going to be disclosed to the school for the sole purpose of determining your eligibility for financial aid and scholarships. This information is not going to be released to any other entities or any other individuals for any other purposes. So the information will be highly protected. One thing to note, when you go in and give consent, or when your parents go in to give consent to have the tax information transferred over, that information will not be visible to you or to the parent on the application. It's going to be protected. You won't see it, which is something different from previously. When you do your FAFSA, you can see the tax information. Even if you do the data retrieval tool, you can see the information that was transferred over. With this process, you will not be able to see the information. It will not be disclosed. So at the end, like when you get your summary of your application, you see all the data that you provided on the form. That tax information will not be showing. Again, this is to protect the integrity of the information that we're getting from the IRS database. So once you complete the application, like I said, you will get a student aid index number, and this is going to be used to determine your eligibility. And so what we'll do is we'll take that SAI number. Again, it's going to be based on student contribution as well as parent contribution in the event that you're a dependent student. And so that number we will use to determine your eligibility. So what we'll do is we'll take, sorry, too fast. So what I wanted to talk about is what the difference is between the EFC and the SAI. So number one is the SAI can be as low as a negative 1,500. So don't freak out if you see a negative number and you're like, what does that mean? So the SAI can be a negative number. It can't go any lower than a negative 1,500. That's the lowest it will go. But if you want to think of it in terms of like the EFC number, if you got a 0 EFC number, that means you qualified for the maximum amount of Pell Grant. Same thing with the SAI. If you happen to get a negative 1,500, it's treated like a 0 EFC. So those students with that negative 1,500, that means you do qualify for the maximum Pell Grant award. Another difference between EFC and SAI is the number of family members in college is being removed from the calculation. A lot of people are not happy about this, but they are removing that factor from the formula to determine your eligibility. The question is still asked on the application, so they're still going to ask how many people that are listed in your household are going to be in college. However, it is not going to be a factor in the formula that's going to determine your eligibility. Another change is the difference, not change. Another difference is child support received. If you happen to report any of that, it's now going to be counted as assets in the formula calculation. Previously, it was counted as untaxed income. And then lastly, anybody with family farms and small businesses, that will now count as assets in the formula. So what we will do currently, like we do with the EFC, we're going to take the cost of attendance and we're going to subtract now your student aid index number to get your financial need. So now let's talk about the Pell Grant and the changes that are coming with that. So as I mentioned, there is going to be a maximum Pell Grant number, and that number has been determined to be $7,395 for this upcoming year. So if you're eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, that's how much you'll receive. It is going to be, so students who are going to receive Pell Grant, there's 3 ways you could potentially be eligible for Pell Grant. Previously, your eligibility was based on the EFC number. And so there was a range of the lowest being 0, and it could go to an infinite number. But in order to qualify for Pell, your EFC had to fall between a certain range. So 0 to, I believe it was like 6,500. As long as your EFC fell within that range, then you qualify for Pell Grant. Well, now, because there's no longer EFC, there's no longer that Pell chart or range anymore. They're now looking at 3 potential formulas or ways that a student can qualify. So under the maximum Pell Grant option, they're going to be looking at the family's adjusted gross income. They're going to be looking at the tax filing status, and they'll be looking at the U.S. poverty level guidelines based on the family size and the state of residence. And then, as I mentioned, anybody who comes out with a negative 1,500, which again is like a 0 EFC, they automatically qualify for maximum Pell Grant. Now, if you don't qualify for maximum Pell Grant, then it's going to be looked at if you can qualify for the calculated Pell Grant. So to qualify for that, what they will do is they will take what the maximum Pell number is, so that's 73.95, and they will subtract whatever your SAI number came out to be. And then whatever the difference is between those two numbers will be your calculated Pell Grant amount. If needed, it will be rounded to the nearest $5. Now, if you don't qualify for the maximum Pell Grant or the calculated Pell Grant, then the third option will be to look and see if you can qualify for the minimum Pell Grant. Again, they're going to be looking at the AGI, the tax filing status, as well as the poverty level guidelines for the family size and the state of residence. Now, if your calculated SAI is greater than the maximum Pell Award, or the calculated Pell amount is less than the minimum Pell Award, then you will not qualify for the Pell Grant. Now, I know this may all sound confusing, and you don't really need to worry about too much about this because it will be done on the back end by Department of Education to let us know where you fall in as far as qualifying for Pell Grant, if you do or you don't. And then, like I said, we'll make that determination based on the information we get from the Department of Ed. Something else that is changing with the Pell Grant is the awarded amount is going to be based on your enrollment intensity. So currently, if you are enrolled half-time status, so whether you're like on the chart, half-time is anywhere between 6 and 8 hours, any student who was within that range would receive a set dollar amount based on their EFC and how much they could receive at that enrollment level. Now, with the new changes, it's not going to be the case. So now it's going to be based on the actual credit numbers. So if you look at the chart again, let's look at the halftime status situation. Somebody who is in 6 hours will get 50% of the eligible awarded amount versus somebody who's in 8 hours can get up to 67% of the amount. So your awarded amount will be based on the credit number hours you are in. Now the 12 or more, it is going to be just capped at 12. So whether you do 12, 15, 18, that number, it's going to be capped at what it is for 12 hours. It will not increase if you're doing 15 or 18. It will stay the same based on what's showing for 12 hours, which is the 100% award amount. All right, so lastly, I wanted to cover the terminology. A lot of these terms we've already covered, but we'll just kind of do a brief summary as well as introduce some other things that I had not talked about yet. So number one, we talked about contributor. Again, that's going to be the individual who's required to provide consent and their signature on your FAFSA application. So again, that's going to be you as a student, if you're dependent, potentially your parents, and then your spouse if you are married. FAFSA submission summary. So this is the summary of the information that you provide on the FAFSA form. So previously it was called your student aid report or SAR. Now it's being called FAFSA submission summary. Student aid index or SAI, again, that's going to be the formula that's used to determine your eligibility for federal student aid, and it is replacing what we know as the EFC. Federal tax information or FTI, this is going to be the data that directly comes from the IRS that was reported on your taxes. The system that we will be using to get that federal tax information is called the Future Act Direct Data Exchange or FADDX. And this system is actually replacing what's currently being used, which is the IRS data retrieval tool to transfer the tax information into the FAFSA application. Next is there is a replacement or a change in terminology. So currently in a cost of attendance, there is what we call room and board. Well, that is now being replaced with the terms food and housing. And then there is something called special circumstances and unusual circumstances. Now, these are not new situations. This is, something that has been available to students depending on their situation, but they're just, I guess, assigning specific terminology to the situations. So special circumstances is going to refer to any extenuating circumstances, such as if there's been a loss in job, Maybe there's been a divorce or death, anything that could cause a change in your financial situation. So that will be called a special circumstance. And you can contact our office to let us know that you have one of those special circumstances. And so what we'll do is we'll provide you, we have a form called an income adjustment form that you can submit, and we'll reevaluate your financial situation based on the information that you provide. The last one, the unusual circumstances. So that's going to refer to making an adjustment to your dependency status. So when you do the FAFSA application, you have to answer some questions to determine whether or not you're considered dependent or independent. And so there are some students that don't meet the typical requirements to be considered independent. However, they cannot provide parents' information for whatever reason. And so they need to be considered for an unusual circumstance. So in that case, they would indicate that on the application. We'll get notification of that when we receive the FAFSA, and then we will let the student know that they can turn in what we call a dependency appeal. And basically, you would be appealing to be considered independent based on the circumstances as to why you don't have access to the parent's information to provide it on the FAFSA. So that would be called an unusual circumstance. All right, so that concludes the information of the changes that are coming or that are now coming as a result of the application being available now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and we can open it up to any questions that you might have. So if you want, you can unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any of those questions. So a question came in, I file my own taxes separate from my own parents. Does that matter? It does not matter. You can file your own separate taxes, but if it's been determined that you are a dependent student and you need to provide parent information, then you will have to provide yours as well as your parents. So you both will be considered contributors. Any other questions? Yes, please do not be shy to ask any questions.
Did you forget to tell them about the quiz, the pop quiz afterwards? Kidding.
I should have. If I am independent, then I don't need my parents' information. That is correct. If you are considered independent, you do not need parents' information. I guess I'll ask anybody here, has anybody already started the application or submitted the application? You can do like a little raise the hand emoji to let me know that you've started the process or you've completed it, just kind of get an idea. Somebody said I submitted it. Very good. Was it pretty simple? I think Skylar Phillips, you indicated you submitted it. Did you feel like it was pretty easy compared to previously? I see some questions coming through. Hold on. My parents. Okay, so for those whose parents don't have an SSN and are going in to try to create that FSA ID, as I mentioned at the end of creating that ID, they do have to answer some questions to verify identity. And so if the questions are not answered correctly, therefore the identity can't be verified, then they are going to have to contact I forget what the name is, but essentially it's going to be Department of Education, their line, to let them know you weren't able to, or that your parent wasn't able to get the FSA ID created because the identity couldn't be verified. They'll open up a case number and they'll send them a form that they'll need to complete. There'll be some documents that they'll have to turn in to show proof of identity. And once all of that has been submitted and identity is verified, then they should be able to get that FSA ID to use. So if your parents have had issues not being able to create that FSA ID, they will need to contact FAFSA. Does the FAFSA affect or contribute to a pre-existing scholarship? That's going to depend on the scholarship, what the requirements are. Some scholarships are looking at FAFSA information, especially if it's a scholarship that's based on need. So yes, potentially a FAFSA could affect your scholarship, just depending. It may not. Very good. Somebody said it took them less than 30 minutes to complete the application. So simpler experience, very simpler experience. So good. So what I will say, a question was asked, how long does it take a FAFSA form to process? So once you've completed it and submitted it, meaning everybody who was identified as a contributor has completed their part, submitted it, you should get an email pretty quickly to let you know it's been processed. Now, we will not get it right away. Normally we would. Normally by this time, we would be getting access to those applications. However, because of all of these changes with the FAFSA, there is a delay on the schools getting the application. So we were supposed to get them at the end of this month, but now it looks like it's being pushed back to February. So we have not actually received anything yet, but it shouldn't take long for Department of Ed to process the form on their end and let you know it was completed. We just don't have access to the forms yet, to the applications. You're welcome. Any other questions? No?